want to thank all of you who are here tonight. This is a wonderful turnout for a truly wonderful book, which I've been devouring all week. You have an enormous treat ahead of you. And first, I'd like to say to everyone here and everyone on our live stream, Happy International Women's Day. So one thing that's very special about this evening is that we're going to celebrate it in part by hearing voices of women, voices we don't always hear and that we would all like to hear more. And that's part of what this book has made possible. So I'd like to say a little bit about UNC Press, which is always a huge pleasure. I am on the Advancement Council, which means that I have the happy job of hassling all of you in Western North Carolina, along with my wonderful colleague Kirk Brown here, and former UNC Press Advancement Council member Doug Orr. Is anyone else from the press here or a past council member? Well, there are many of us. Watch out for us in Asheville. And we're very proud of the press. The press publishes fantastic books like this one. It publishes not only academic books, but many books that are for a general audience. And it is a special voice for the state, for the region, internationally, in fact. It helps put North Carolina on the global map. UNC Press publishes a book every 3 days. And these books are carefully juried. They go through a very intensive process, as Cami can tell you, I'm sure. And they are truly beautifully produced. So when you see a UNC Press book, please tell other people about it. We also want to say that we are so honored by our partnership with Malaprops. This has been one of the great experiences I know I've ever been involved in, and the press is deeply grateful. Malaprops helped us keep going in terms of presentation throughout the time we had only remote events. They were absolutely stalwart, and they're truly a model for collaboration between a press and an independent bookstore. And I know they collaborate with many other people, many other entities. We have other partners in the region. One of them is the North Carolina Arboretum. And I know some of you are fans of books about the environment, the natural world, or avid gardeners, or all three. And please watch for those as well. I also want to say, as we gradually are in person again, and very happy to have our live stream audience too, we'll be continuing that. If you are part of a fine institution in Western North Carolina, an organization, and your organization would like to host a program with a UNC Press author, please get in touch with us. You can get in touch with me after the program, with Kirk Brown, or write to Malaprops. We are very interested in expanding, and we publish books on so many different kinds of topics that there probably is one for you and your organization. So please consider hosting us. Now I have the very happy job of introducing two people I've come to admire enormously on paper and now in person. And I'm just gonna hand Cami my this for a minute. It's the paper shuffle on live stream. So Cami Ahrens joined the Foxfire Museum in 2017. She is the editor of this book. And when you pick this book up, you'll get a little glimpse into what an enormous amount of work this book was. And I hope that she'll be telling us about that. She is Curator and Director of Education at Foxfire Museum, responsible for curating artifacts and archival materials, developing exhibits and publications. And she also manages programs at the museum, which to me sounds like 5 people. She also hosts and produces their monthly podcast, It Still Lives, which I highly recommend. Cami serves as executive editor for the Foxfire Magazine, which many of us grew up reading, lying under the kitchen table. And I'm sure many of us have very fond memories of that. And it's exciting to see how alive and well this is. She oversees the organization's program for high school students as well. She's originally from the St. Louis area. She attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for graduate school, and then came to Georgia, which is our great benefit having you in the region. And you can find her rock climbing or hiking in the mountains with her husband and 2 golden retrievers when she's not doing these 5 other jobs, right? So welcome, really wonderful to have you here. I also want to introduce our interviewer tonight, who is a distinguished fiction writer. I know many of you know and love her work, Annette Saunooke Clapsaddle. She is an enrolled member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. She holds degrees from Yale University and the College of William and Mary. And her work, Going to Water, which is up here on the table, is, I'm sorry?
Going to Water is not on
the table. Oh, it's not? Oh, I'm sorry. Which book is on the table?
Even as we breathe.
Even as we breathe. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the back of the book. I want to recommend both of them. But I bet the other one's in the store here too, right? So her work, Going to Water, which is not the one on the table, won the Morningstar Award for Creative Writing from the Native American Literature Symposium and was a finalist for the Penn Bellwether Prize for socially engaged fiction, which is a really big deal. If you pick these up, I think you'll get an kind of prose that we just, I want to hear you read. I haven't heard you read aloud yet. It is just beautiful. So she is also co-editor of the Journal of Cherokee Studies, speaking of 5 jobs, and serves on the board of trustees for the North Carolina Writers Network. And she resides in Qualla, North Carolina. So please welcome these 2 distinguished authors and editors. Thank you for being here.
I am thrilled to be back at Malaprop's. I love this bookstore. And I was so honored and excited that Cammie asked that I join her today, because this book is incredibly important for the region. What you don't know is I have friends in Kentucky that are like, this book, we've got to get our hands on this book. When's it coming out? So, you know, I know that there's a lot of buzz in Western North Carolina and in Georgia, but I think all over Appalachia, and I bet all over the country pretty soon, for the work that you've done. So this is really exciting. I also want to say, since we heard a little bit about UNC Press, I want to give a shout out to UNC Press, and they are not my publisher, so I'm not, this is genuine. They were the first and maybe the only press that I know of that has come to Cherokee and sat down with folks and said, we just want to know what stories are out there. We want to know who's writing. We want to know what opportunities there are. I mean, literally came to Cherokee, which doesn't happen often. So thank you to UNC Press. Now, speaking of doing the work, if you'll just tell us a little bit about kind of your background that led you to the work that you're doing at Foxfire, and especially the research that may have led you to this specific project.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. This is wonderful to see you all here, and a special thank you to UNC Press, and especially to Annette for being here with us today, and to the Foxfire organization and all the students who have done most of the work for the past 55 plus years. So it's a great honor to be here and to be representing Foxfire. I've really enjoyed my time with the organization. So this project came about when I first started at Foxfire. I was reading everything there was on Foxfire, every book, going through all the magazines. And in each book, if you read a Foxfire book, you'll know that there's a variety of topics covered, but there are also what we call personality articles. So there's stories that just focus on one person's experiences in Appalachia. And I kept coming across these women's stories that were just stopping me in my tracks. I mean, just little things that they would say to the students that maybe the students would have never picked up on, but now looking back 50 years later, they're really profound statements, profound experiences. And it just seemed to me that there needed to be a space where those women's stories could come together. And so I started having conversations about this. And we just thought it would be a good idea for a book, and UNC was all about it. They were behind us from the get-go, which was wonderful to have their support. And it was really hard to narrow down the women, as I'm sure you can imagine. We have close to 2,700 oral histories in our archive. So quite a few. And so as I was going through them, I was collecting them into groups and struggling with how to put them together. And I talked to a researcher about it, and she gave me a piece of advice that really hit home. And that was to let the women speak to each other and to see what conversations they had. And so with that in mind, I could really start to see the threads of commonality that were coming out from these incredibly different stories. And in a way, the book just started putting itself together. And I did a couple of additional interviews to kind of bring it into contemporary times. And those pieces just really helped it all come together and become what it is now.
Great, I love that. Let them speak to each other. And it really does feel like that. When I was reading the book, I was like, well, I'll read one story, or I'll read one interview, then I'll come back, but I couldn't stop, right? Like, because they are in conversation. I also like immediately started planning a garden for the year too, which is totally your fault when that fails. But
Did you do it by the signs?
okay, well, we'll talk about this because I want to talk about that in a second. I'm really excited about planning about the signs. You mentioned that these interviews were mostly done in the 70s. Is that correct, or started in the 70s?
Yes, so Foxfire started in 1967 and 1966 with the first recordings done in 1967. And so the book starts with the first woman interviewed in 1967. And then a lot of interviews happened in the 1970s. That's when Foxfire really gained traction, as well as into the 80s. But I tried to pick some from each decade so that we were getting kind of a long look over time at cultural change here in the mountains.
Yeah. So what did you see in those interviews that you think the original students who interviewed these women may have not had the ability to see because they haven't lived into this time period, right? What lens do you think you were able to add to those?
That's a good question. There's certainly a lot of things that we look back with. I had the bias of having encountered a lot of other stories and kind of have a sense of some of the themes that I wanted to pick up on. But certainly just the physical space, I think, is probably what stood out to me the most, was thinking about who the interviewers were and thinking about where those students, what their background might have been, and how the relationship in that moment with that woman that was speaking to them may have impacted them. So, for example, in the early 70s, there was still a lot of segregation in Reagan County. And so what would it have felt like for these white students to finally have the opportunity to sit down with a Black person or an Indigenous person, and thinking about how those interactions in a physical space would have been different in a different time. And even now, when I take students out on interviews, there are things that the students now can't do that they would have been able to do in the 70s, like swing an axe on an interview. I mean, that's what they were doing. And now I feel like
shoot a gun, right?
There is a great picture of Ethel Horn teaching Karen Cox how to shoot a shotgun, and that's may not be something that I would let a student do today. So it is things like that, those physical interactions, those movements through the physical space that I think about a lot.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that these interviews are done by high school students in large part, since I was a former high school teacher. So the flip side of this is, what do you think they were able to bring to the interviews because they were younger, right? That you wouldn't have gotten from maybe a formal researcher?
Yeah, so I see this again with the students that I work with. A lot of them just have this sense of, innocence and like asking questions without abandon. Whereas like I have like all these like calculated things in my head. It's like, well, I should ask this, I shouldn't ask this happens, but kids just go in and they just want to know, like they're just hungry for information. They're not afraid to ask questions. And when they're engaged, there's a special relationship, a special moment that happens between the person they're interviewing and that kid, because there's this great intergenerational connection, which I'm sure you've witnessed. We probably all have witnessed, but there's, a certain openness that comes from maybe an older person when they see that a younger person is genuinely interested in them and their stories.
Absolutely. How about we give the audience a little taste? So we've talked a lot about the changes in time. So I know that there are a few passages that reflect how Appalachia and Appalachian women have changed over time. So maybe if there's a passage you'd like to share with us in that theme.
So this comes, the two short excerpts from the last chapter with Kay Carver Collins. And I don't know if y'all can see, but Kay was actually involved with Foxfire before she was in high school because her dad was a renowned moonshiner in Rankin County. And so the students in 1968 did a robust issue on moonshining. And so Kay was witness to those interviews with her dad. And then when she was in high school, she participated in the Foxfire program. And then in the 90s, she actually worked for Foxfire. And so she still serves as a volunteer with Foxfire today. And so she has, again, this kind of long-standing history with Foxfire, this understanding how things changed over time. But she grew up with 10 siblings. So she grew up poor in a small house in a very older style of living. And so we're just going to start with when she was a child and then switch to a passage when she's talking about some of the changes that have happened. So she says, I'm the youngest, Faye, who's her twin. She's 1 hour older than I am. I pushed her out and said, if it's okay, come back and get me. And she never did that. Her nickname is Bit. Bit and I were thick as thieves. One wouldn't go anywhere without the other until we were probably 10 or 11 years old. Fortunately, my sister Mary Jane lived right across the field from us, and she had 2 daughters who were just a couple years younger than my twin sister and I. So they were more like sisters to me than some of my older sisters were. When we started school, one day my twin sister got sick and the teacher wanted to keep her in at recess. Well, I wasn't going to go out to recess without my twin sister. So I'm sitting there with her and the teacher leaves the room and comes back in and she's got this potato. And she's like, here, eat this. It will help your stomach. And I jump out of my chair with my hands on my hips. My sister's not eating a raw tater. I'd never seen a baked potato. I was about to have a fit because she was trying to feed my sister a raw potato. The older sisters down to Claudia were more like aunts to me because they helped raise me. They sort of bossed me around. Some of them were already gone by the time I came along. I mean, my oldest sister was 18 years older than I was. Mary Jane was already married and lived across the field from us. My sisters Erlene and Hilda were living in Brunswick. I guess the rest of us were still at home. When I got older, we moved to the sisters' bedroom. There was 6 of us in that one bedroom, and there was only rafters overhead, tin roof. So in the morning, of course, the dew would stick to it, and as the sun came up, it would start to dissipate and it would flop down on your head. We didn't need an alarm clock. We had a rooster. Its name was Chickadee. It was a little banty rooster. And my mother would go to the back door of a morning and say, Chickadee, go wake them up. Chickadee would come through the house, get on the bedpost for the bed, and crow until we got up. My mom was unusual in a lot of ways. Her mother died when she was 10 years old. She was the oldest, and she quit school. She was in the 4th grade and stayed home to take care of her 2 little brothers and her baby sister. She told us that she had to stand on a chair to reach the stove to cook. So she's been a hard worker her entire life. Later on, she went up to Canton, North Carolina, and worked in the paper mills up there. She didn't marry until she was about 24 years old, which was very unusual for women back then. She always worked outside the home, always. She cooked, she was a maid, she did whatever she had to do to keep the family together. Oh, I have to tell you this story. Bless her heart. Like I said, her mother died when she was 10, and my mother always thought her mother's name was Cinderella. Isn't that sweet? So I get to do the family research. Her name was Cynthia Ellen, but Mama heard it as Cinderella. I think you can stereotype any group of people if you choose to. I think it's a matter of choosing to meet people where they are and discovering who they are, not stereotyping. I think our identity is being swallowed up in the global world. I think that very few people have that kind of identity anymore because we're such a global society. People don't tell me I sound like I've lived here all my life. I tell them, well, I've lived with a Yankee for 30 something years. You know, I can still say gone and ate and all that stuff, but it's not like it was when I was growing up. We were very isolated. We got 3 TV channels, and that was only if the antenna was turned the right way. I didn't have a telephone until I was 17 years old. I was on a Foxfire trip to Chicago, Illinois, and I called my neighbor to let them know we'd arrived, and she said, oh, you can call home. Here's the number. There's no place like these mountains. I can be having an absolutely horrible day and just go sit down and look at the mountains, and peace comes over me. My favorite thing when I leave here, I don't like to leave here, is when I come back and I top that hill in Hollywood, Georgia, and you see those mountains up in front of you. My whole body just relaxes.
Oh, that. Thank you. Yeah, I think that piece is really emblematic of why this whole book is important, because it addresses so many topics that we don't always think about when we think about Appalachia and Appalachian women. So, you know, the first thing that stands out to me is this sense of humor that she has, right? And I know in Cherokee culture, sense of humor is one of our core values, right? It's one of 7. And so I know that you find that throughout the book. Why do you think that resonated so much throughout all of the interviews, this like commonality of sense of humor that you hear from these women?
Yeah, there are some really funny stories, and they definitely, even just in the way, and you can tell with the way Kay speaks and the way that other women speak, they do have this prevailing sense of humor. And I think they have this sense of resiliency in many ways, that a lot of them have been through some hard stuff, but they just find a way to keep going forward. And I think picking up on humor and picking up on enjoyment and enjoying where they are, especially place. This is such a place-based book. I think that just helps them live a better life and share that with the students, and to find the joy in where they live.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that was also mentioned in that passage was her talking about work outside of the home. And I know some women talk about both men and women working at home, right, and not leaving. But I'm curious well, I'm not curious because I've read the book. They may be curious. What changes to work for women occurred from kind of the beginning of these interviews to the latter interviews in the book?
Yeah, that was kind of an interesting thing that I encountered during the research, was that, you know, in some instances, women were really the first ones to leave home and get paid work, whether it was through domestic help, which we see in some of the earlier stories, or later in, I think, the 40s and 50s, the mills started coming in. And that was the first opportunity for a lot of people to be paid labor. And a lot of the men would go off and do logging or harvest trees for tanning bark. But in many ways, that was still kind of a home-based activity. They didn't necessarily have to go and work for somebody. But the women become, you know, a backbone in many cases, that they are earning a cash income, and that comes as the economy starts to change. So we see transportation developments, tourism developing in the area, and other economic factors that make people shift away from a sustainable economy to one where they need cash to pay for things. And in a lot of cases, that responsibility fell to women. And certainly, as I mentioned, working in domestic service was very common at the beginning. There's one woman whose mother actually ends up leaving her children full time with the grandparent so that she can go out and work without the children, and sends money back home.
So you mentioned that this book was very much about place and the importance of place. And you know, I think that's true in a lot of Appalachian literature. as well. But I've spent a lot of time thinking about what makes Appalachian people so fiercely connected to this region. It appears to me, I'm completely biased, but it appears to me more so than other regions, our identity to Appalachian culture and to this place, because you're not just talking about rural Appalachia in this book, you're also talking about urban spaces as well. So what were your takeaways about this connection to place?
It's been something that's fascinated me since I've arrived here. As you all heard, I am from Missouri originally, and even though we do have, a connection to place, it's very different from what it is here in Appalachia. It's such a core piece of Appalachian identity, and certainly you would know much better than I would. We've had conversations about this as well, but it's something strong about this place that people want to be here and they want to make that part of their identity. But there's also something that the land seems to give back to them in the conversations that they have. And I think it's somehow a sense of belonging. I'm still learning about it, but in the stories in the book, they seem to refer to the landscape in relationship terms. So not necessarily place-based terms, but you can just tell from the way that Kay speaks of the mountains that they offer her something deeper than just going outside and looking at nature. And I'm still unpacking what that is and still researching and discovering, but it may just be something inherent in the culture. And certainly I think we can all feel that there's a certain magic about this place when we walk outside in the woods. It definitely does draw us in.
Yeah, well, I think that brings me to the most important question tonight. Is how do I plant by the signs? I'm so fascinated by this. This is completely, a personal question for me, but there is some discussion about planting by astrological signs. So I immediately am Googling, right, to try to find a book. And of course, there's Foxfire materials on this. This is different than planting by the moon. So I want to be clear that I found lots of resources on this, but I had some trouble finding anything on that wasn't like crazy expensive on astrological signs. And I remember when I visited Foxfire, we talked about this, and I was kind of surprised by that because I personally thought, well, astrological signs is this new agey thing, right? So to just appease my own curiosity, will you tell these folks a little bit about the specific interview on that?
Yeah, so Margaret Norton, interviewed in 1967, had all kinds of folklore that she shared with the students, but she was a very strong proponent of planting by the signs. And I should clarify, it's not just planting. You can do and should do everything by the signs. The signs will tell you when to cut your hair, when to dig a hole, anything.
Kill a pig.
Kill a hog, yes, absolutely. Because if you don't kill it on the right sign, you won't get any fat in the meat and other things like that, or it won't cure right. So what's interesting about planting by the signs of the zodiac is that it was practiced by people of very deep Christian faith. So Margaret Norton connects it to the passage, I think it's in Ecclesiastes, where there's time for everything. And so she believes that this is the way that it's meant to be. This is the order of the universe, is that you follow the signs. And so the idea is, and don't quote me on this because it may not be the correct sign association, but each sign of the zodiac is associated with a different body part, and that body part somehow relates to the planting or the activity. So this is the part you shouldn't quote me, because I'm not sure if this is 100% correct, but you shouldn't plant your sweet potatoes when the signs are in the arms, because all you'll get is vines. And there are certain things that you plant when the signs are in the bowels, because they grow underneath the ground, and signs are in the feet. And so you can actually get a calendar from the Farmer's Almanac, and if you look closely, it'll have a little sign in the corner of each day, and you can check the sign and plan out when you're going to plant stuff. But yes, it was very commonly practiced in Southern Appalachia, and there are some people who still swear by it.
Yeah, love that. I think it's fascinating. Okay, so I am curious. You talked about how many interviews Foxfire has in the archives, and we talked a little earlier about you having to determine which ones you were going to include and whatnot. So let's say you have volume 2. And you have much more space for more interviews, even interviews that may not have been conducted yet. So who going forward, or what types of voices going forward, would you like to include in the next volume?
Well, your interview would be a good start. We had a great conversation a couple of years ago. That's a hard question because there's so many, there's so many things, there's so many changes happening in this region. I would certainly continue to want to collect from maybe regions outside of Raven and Macon County, North Carolina, which is where a lot of the interviews are sourced from. Definitely looking at different experiences. There's a lot more immigrant populations that have come into the region that are growing, certainly including more newcomers, maybe some COVID transplants would be interesting stories. But we are, in conjunction with this book, conducting a crowdsourced oral history project, because this book isn't meant to be like the book of Appalachian women. It's the Foxfire book of some Appalachian women, right? So we want the story to continue. We want it to be a foundation for people to start conversations in their own communities, in their own families, to understand that sharing our stories makes us better, it makes us stronger, it makes us resilient. And so we have a oral history project that you can go to our website and you can sit down with somebody. If you are a woman, identify as a woman, know of a woman that has or has lived in Appalachia, you can just sit down with them and have a conversation, because that's where stories start. And so we do invite those stories to come become a part of Foxfire and to help build these conversations in our community. But yeah, I could see volume 2 taking all kinds of different directions as well.
I love the crowdsourcing oral history project. I think it's a great idea, and I can't wait to see what comes out of it. So we have a couple of minutes before we take audience questions. And so maybe these two things are related. I wanted to ask you if there was one interview that stuck with you even past the printing of the book, that you just kind of lie awake and think about something one of these women said, and then follow that with, if you'll give us a reading from one more passage before we open it up.
Sure, I'd love to do that. The first woman that really stuck out to me when I was going through the Foxfire books and the magazines and the archives was Anna Tutt, and I just couldn't put her story down. I just kept going back to it and going back to it. And she paints an interesting picture, having grown up as a child of sharecropper, and her parents died really young. And then she goes and lives with her grandmother. And she is a Black woman. And so she has these experiences of growing up in the Jim Crow South. But what's more interesting to me in her passage is the relationship she forms with her grandmother. And in all of the stories, I think that's what stuck out to me the most, was they have these rich experiences, diverse experiences, but it's the relationships that they talk about that really I keep going back to. So there's a woman, Flora Youngblood, who talks a lot about her dad. Carrie Stewart, who I'll probably share a passage from, talks a lot about her husband. And some people talk about their children. And it's really, I think, those relationships that resonate the most with me, and I hope with the people who read it, because it draws you closer into a relationship with them, I think. But yeah, I would be happy to share with a passage from Carrie Stewart. That's probably, I'll just put it down. I didn't have Post-its, so I had to go with paper clips. So I do want to share this passage from Carrie Stewart. Now, Carrie, again, I have pictures that I can pass around. Carrie was almost 100 years old at the time this picture was taken, so she's looking pretty good. But she lived to be over 100. And, you know, I have the great privilege of being able to listen to these stories. So I get to hear the audio, and some of this is shared through our podcast. So when I read these things, like I can hear her voice in my head. And she was just so sharp and again, so funny, so on top of it. But what's amazing about her story is, you know, I mentioned she talks about her husband. And in this passage, she talks about how her husband didn't want her to work, but she had 10 children and she was a midwife. So I just want to share this little bit from her and kind of think about the work that maybe women do that isn't always recognized as paid labor. And after one of my daughters got to be 6 or 7 years old, I thought to myself, well, it looks like I could go out and work too. But my husband said, no, the children would waste more than both of us could bring in. He felt we'd have more by me staying at home and having a little garden and raising some chickens and taking care of the youngins than working out. So he thought it was better for me to stay home. He was right that way. I'll be 100 on November 28th, 1978, and I have never worked. My husband didn't believe in the mother going out to work and leaving the oldest child to take care of the younger children. I was a licensed midwife. I started when my children were almost grown. I went to the class to take instruction regularly every spring. When we started, I think there was 4 colored and several white women. Several dropped out, but I just stayed right in there. We had to have 3 permits. When you got an A permit, you had the highest one, and I was determined to get my A permit. I stayed right in there until I got it. Then I could go on any calls I wanted to. I had my bag with my own equipment, scissors, a fingernail brush, towels, face mask, and a big apron with pockets all around. Oh, we had to have all that. I went all times of the night. When a patient called me, I was ready to go. I just wanted to keep up, and I did. I did the midwifing for a lot of my friends too. Of course, you see, there weren't many doctors then. There were several white midwives and 3 colored at one time. The father of a white boy I took care of passed through Franklin last summer. He laughed and said somebody had told him I lived yet. He wanted to come by and see me, and I said, I wanted to tell you about your boy. He's married now, and he's got children. My grandmother was a midwife, and she delivered several of my children. After she died, there was another old lady that delivered one of my babies, and Dr. Harry Jones, a white doctor, delivered my last baby. I followed midwifing a long time, but after my husband died, I quit. I think to a certain extent that women have a right to go out and work, and they have a right to stay home and let the husband carry on. Somewhere I read that a woman wasn't supposed to speak in the church service. She was supposed to speak to her husband and let him take care of it. It seems to me that women now have the lead in more things than they ever had before.
I love that she says, I have never worked. I was like, after you listed everything she's done. Also, if I had 10 children, I would want to work outside of them. Thank you, Kimmy. It's been great being able to ask you all the questions.
Thank you so much, Annette. I appreciate having you here tonight.
So we will open it up to audience questions. We've got a full audience today. So back here.
Good day. First of all, beautiful work. Thank you. It's eye-opening, heart-centered, and very moving. So thank you very much. I'm very grateful. I'm a documentarian and a singer-songwriter, and I've done a program on Sense of Place. But I always try to find the common theme of music that weaves, between and among the generations. Did anybody's answers come up around music, or were the questions not pointed towards that? And in your next series, because it's, you look at Johns Hopkins, music lights up more tendrils in the brain than anything else. Okay, and storytelling, it's good for you. But it's also something that just soothes people. It makes them come home to something that the parents value and the grandparents value. I heard your storytelling, I loved it. I didn't hear anything about music. Did it just not come up?
Yes, I didn't bring it up. I apologize. So there's actually a woman in here, Addie Norton, and she talks a lot about singing and the importance of shape note singing. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, shape note singing, which is now known either by Christian Harmony or Sacred Heart, is an old style of singing that is in 4-part harmony, and you literally follow shapes like triangles, diamonds, squares, to tell you the melody. So each of those shapes corresponds to a different syllable. And so she talks a lot about what music does for her. And it's a really powerful passage on her commitment to music and what it's done for her. And there are certainly numerous other Foxfire books that address music in more depth, especially maybe instruments. We have some really great articles on instruments. Unfortunately, there was a woman I had thought to include in the book, but the nature of historic audio is that a lot of it is hard to hear, and sometimes it gets corrupted. And unfortunately, that particular interview, the interview portion was not legible enough, and the transcript only captured a few parts of it, but the music on it was amazing, and we do have that available on our website.
Oh, thank you. So you're enjoying it.
Do they have demonstrations at Foxfire of shape note singing?
We are having a singing this spring, this April, so
Cetera.
check our website.
I want to say something on the shape notes, it's really interesting about astrology, like Palmer's almanac, basically, and astrology. It's kind of like that goes along with yoga poses or sacred geometry. I don't know if everybody knows what I'm talking about, but it's interesting how shapes and colors go along with music for profound spiritual enlightenment. And some of the most rural areas of West Virginia have the most powerful songs. So, thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. There's obviously a great tradition of music here that comes in many formats.
Just a follow-up to the Addie Norton story. David Holt interviewed Addie Norton years ago in her latter years, and brought some instruments with him, including the washboard. She said, "Honey, would you play that thing I haven't heard her play in 85 years?" Tammy, congratulations to Foxfire for a prodigious amount of work, but also sustaining these voices. A favorite question of mine for writers, including toward myself, is what were the unexpected surprises in the course of the work?
Again, a very good question. I think just the depth to which some of these women shared their stories. There's a lot of vulnerability in here that I wasn't expecting. Again, when you're thinking about the situation of these interviews, kids asking older people about, their childhoods or a certain experience. Because a lot of times the students go in with a specific topic in mind. So they'll be like, I want some good recipes. Can you tell me about cooking on a wood stove? And next thing you know, it's opened up this memory of a young girl whose mother just died, and her father asking her at 10 to take over managing a household. So it's those unexpected memories that are triggered by these questions that the students ask, but also the women's willingness to just become vulnerable and immediately share these stories. And so for me, I was just really taken aback and honored to be the recipient of, reading those stories and hearing those voices. Yeah, good question.
Back.
Got one from the online audience over here. It says, how difficult was it narrowing down the selection of women for this book against what you found in the archives?
It was an impossible task. Yeah, I had a list of probably like 50 or 60 to start with, and I was like, I have to get this down to 20 or 21. It was really difficult, and unfortunately, a lot of the decisions were made by the quality or quantity of material available. Working with historic audio and again the historic transcripts, and then also using that advice and looking at what each woman brought to the table. And unfortunately, there were some that was like, well, too similar. And I wanted to make sure that we were getting a good representation across topics, across time, across space. And so it was a really difficult process. And then of course, like as soon as I turned in the manuscript, I had like 5 other interviews that you either find in the archive or, the students did, or I went out on an interview that was just, oh man, I wish I could have included that. So again, like this is the beginning, this is a foundation piece. It's something that I hope can grow. And certainly the Foxfire archives are always growing every year with the students' work.
I wish I had a better question. I work with Cammy regularly, and we talk about this a lot. I think this book does a great job of like spanning the breadth of Appalachian women. And we talked a lot about sense of place. And I think it's so interesting that, you know, you're not from here, I'm from Franklin. So like, I think you speak so eloquently about it. And there's like a passage right at the end that I think is so beautiful. And you do such a good job articulating the relationship between women and each other and the mountains. And I don't know if you want to read it, if that's something, I'm not a plant, I swear.
Which passage is it? Can I borrow your Post-it? Oh, thank you. So, okay, this is why you should have Post-its, not paper clips. Though the Foxfire women never say it outright, they speak of the mountains in much the same way they speak of their mothers, their aunts, their mentors, and even of themselves. The surface of the landscape changes, but the mountains stay the same. Similar to how the women grow, but remain true to themselves. The mountains provide strength, tranquility, and comfort in ways that are similar to how our mothers, relatives, and friends support us in times of crisis and joy.
Do you want that?
I think so.
I'm not exactly sure how to articulate my question, but I've been thinking a lot about the different communities that this work touches. So there's the community of women who are telling their stories and the ripples that go out from that. And then if you think of it sort of like a Venn diagram, then you've got the community of the students who are the interviewers and the ripples that go out from that. And so it seems like what's really represented here are those stories of the women. And if I had been one of the students who had conducted one of these interviews, how powerful that would be for me to see that in print 30, 40, however many years later. And so has there been, or what has been the interaction with the people who were kids back then and are now adults, and I'm sure were profoundly affected by this experience, and how are they engaging with this work?
We do have a great community board. So Foxfire, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, we are a museum, nonprofit, and we have, you know, a traditional national board, but we're also really lucky to have a community board that's primarily made up of former students from, you know, all across the decades. And they really guide a lot of our work, especially when it comes to research. They provide so much valuable input. I was so fortunate to have, you know, students who did interviews help me read and review this book to make sure it was true to Foxfire. We have former students who come and volunteer at the museum in different capacities. Some of them are even demonstrators of traditional crafts. And then a lot of them just stay connected virtually as well. And we're just very fortunate to have that network there and established and to have their support in a lot of what we do. And you have to remember, like, a lot of the students in the 70s and 80s, like that was like the height of Foxfire, where they were publishing a lot of books. So they are, you know, really well adept at working in publications and getting magazines and books out. And so I think it's more important to them that it's still going on, and that it's still important to all of you people as well, and that it's still making a difference, I think, is the really important takeaway. Any other questions?
Oh, I have a question. This is not exactly a writing or editing question, but I'm curious about what brought you here to this job and how that happened. There must be a good story in itself.
I get that question every time.
Yeah.
Usually it's like, you're not from here, are you? No, it's okay. I just laugh because, you know, at this point I feel like I should have a ready answer, and I'm still like, well, let me tell you my story. No, so I was godmastering from my master's program, and as the, you know, typical person online looking for a job, and my godmother was helping me out and sending me job posts, and she was like, you should apply to this one in Georgia. Like, I used to read the Foxfire books. I think this is perfect for you. And I was like, I've never been to Georgia before. I just don't know about going to a town of 3,000 people, having grown up in St. Louis. There's no Target.
But I applied because I trust my mother deeply. And sure enough, I got an interview, and we had a virtual call, and I just knew, you just have a gut feeling. And I just knew that this was the place that I was supposed to go next. And so my father and I packed up a U-Haul, and 2 days later we were in Georgia unpacking said U-Haul, and I've been here ever since. So even though my master's was in archaeology, I was really interested in museum studies and digital humanities, mostly focusing on how we connect with people. How do we take artifacts, everyday artifacts, and how do we look at the stories of people's lives? And so it was just a perfect fit. And I have a natural interest in craft and making and nature. And so I've been incredibly fortunate to work with an amazing staff, especially Barry Stiles, who's been an incredible mentor for me these past 5 years, guiding me in all things Foxfire, but all things Appalachia, but has also just taught me so much about how to relate to people. And I think that's a really important piece of Appalachian culture, is how our relationships are formed and how we navigate this landscape together as a community.
Over.
Okay. Well, I do have one question that I meant to get to before we end, because it's also a moment of gratitude as a writer. You made a conscious decision to include the original words, the original transcript, really, of these women and how they spoke. And we can see the shift through time and place. And it's such a treasure trove of dialect and cadence. And I get really nerdy about it when I think about, as a writer writing dialogue. So was that a decision you felt you had to mull over for a while, or did you know from the beginning you were going to capture their words?
It was a decision from the beginning. So that's a choice that Foxfire made with their very first publications, when we very first started in the 60s and 70s with the magazine publications, and then 1972 with the very first Foxfire book, was that they transcribed, in the way that people spoke, which led to some strange spellings and maybe a bit difficult to read sometimes. But it was really important to them that they somehow captured, as you mentioned, the dialect, because the dialect is disappearing, if not gone already. And so I wanted to honor the students' decision and to preserve that, and then to continue that forward as best I could. And that's what makes this book, I think, so different, is that it is like you're listening to audio, like you are listening to an interview. It's very lightly edited in terms of what they say.
We have time for one more question. Okay, we've got right here. Oh, yeah,
I'm curious about your reaction when you moved to Georgia from Iowa, and how you, what was most striking to you, the differences?
Probably the food. So I'm from the Midwest, and I really didn't think that there would be a huge cultural difference. I have relatives from southern rural Missouri that has a lot of similarities actually to Appalachian culture, but there were a lot of cultural differences that were just unexpected, but I really was not prepared for how different the food was. I'm a big lover of food, love to cook. My mother grows a great garden, but here food is just very different, especially in the community where I live, because there's so much that's locally grown still. And I was just in awe of the fact that people were eating cornbread made from seeds that have been passed down for generations. And when people go out in the community and they talk about what plant they're growing, the first thing they ask is, well, where's your seed from? And there's also, a lot of other culinary differences that were unexpected. Like cornbread here is completely different from where I grew up, but the origin, I think, of the foods is what really struck me the most when I moved here.
Well, thank you, Cami, and thanks to Malaprops in the audience.
Yes, thank you all so much for Malaprops.